The morning of our final asset hearing, my husband didn't just walk into the family courthouse. He marched in like a conqueror claiming his prize. He adjusted the cuffs of his bespoke Italian suit, leaned down until his breath brushed against my ear, and whispered with absolute venom, "Make sure you take a good look around this room, Clara. Because by the afternoon, you won't even have enough money to buy a train ticket out of this city." Beside him, the younger woman he had been secretly traveling with for the past 18 months let out a soft, mocking laugh that echoed off the polished marble walls. She smoothed down her designer dress and looked at me with genuine pity, adding just loud enough for the bailiff to hear, "Some people simply don't know when they've outlived their usefulness." I didn't flinch. I didn't summon an angry retort, nor did I grant them the satisfaction of seeing tears in my eyes. The anger that used to consume me had burned itself down to cold, quiet ash weeks ago. Instead, I turned around, unzipped my worn leather briefcase, and extracted a thick, wax-sealed manila envelope. I handed it to my attorney, a sharp, unreadable woman who had spent decades dismantling corporate shields, and whispered a single directive. "When the defense finishes their opening statement, make sure the bench receives this directly." Less than 10 minutes later, the heavy oak doors of the courtroom closed, sealing out the noise of the city. The judge, a seasoned magistrate with a reputation for spotting deception from a mile away, broke the seal on that envelope. He scanned the first page, paused to look over the rims of his glasses at my husband, and then slowly turned to the second. The silence in the room grew heavy, suffocatingly dense, until the judge placed the documents down with a soft thud and uttered 5 words that completely derailed my husband's grand strategy. "This changes the entire equation. My name is Clara Vance. I am 39 years old, and until that precise second in the courtroom, my husband truly believed he could erase 15 years of shared history with a few expensive legal motions. When he smiled at me in that hallway, he genuinely thought my silence was a sign of total defeat. 5 years ago, an insult like that would have completely shattered my spirit. It would have kept me awake for weeks, wondering where I had gone wrong. But that morning, his arrogance didn't even register as a threat because I possessed a meticulous record of the truth. A truth he had spent years trying to bury. To understand how a partnership degrades to the point of absolute warfare, you have to look back to the very beginning, long before the high-rise offices and the luxury vehicles existed. I met Julian when we were both 24. At the time, he was a brilliant but penniless engineer with an obsession for developing specialized agricultural supply chain software. He had plenty of ambition but absolutely zero capital. I had a stable career as a senior financial analyst for a major shipping corporation, a modest but comfortable studio apartment, and a reservoir of belief in his potential that surpassed common sense. Everyone in his immediate circle warned him that breaking into the enterprise software market was a financial suicide mission. I was the lone voice telling him to leap. When we married 2 years later in a small civil ceremony, we established a clear, unspoken pact. I would serve as the financial foundation of our lives, covering every real-world expense so he could devote 18 hours a day to coding and pitching to empty rooms. Once the company stabilized and scaled, we would enjoy the security together as equal partners. That was the blueprint we drew up on our cheap laminate kitchen table. But the reality of those early years was grueling. The company brought in virtually no revenue for the first 36 months. There were dark winter nights when Julian would come home, put his head in his hands, and declare that he was going to fold the business and look for a standard mid-level job. Every single time he faltered, I would sit beside him, pull his hands away from his face, and remind him of the architecture of his own dream. I took on every scrap of overtime my firm offered. My single salary paid the rent, bought the groceries, covered our medical insurance, and directly funded his initial server costs and software licensing fees when his first round of angel investors backed out at the last second. I consciously chose to delay my own dreams. I put off entering a prestigious executive fellowship program because we couldn't handle the tuition alongside his business overhead. I drove a car with a failing transmission for 3 years. I forgot what a vacation felt like. But I never complained because every single sacrifice felt like a brick we were laying together for our collective future. Whenever Julian had a breakthrough, he would hold me tight and say the exact same phrase, "One day, Clara, this empire will belong to both of us." I believed him completely, never realizing that success possesses a strange, toxic ability to rewrite a person's memory. The shift happened with terrifying speed in our 8th year of marriage. One of Julian's proprietary logistics platforms caught the attention of a major international conglomerate. Within a year and a half, the business exploded across 4 separate territories. Suddenly, there were corporate profiles, industry awards, and invitations to speak at national tech summits. Julian was transformed overnight into the poster child of self-made tech entrepreneurs. At first, my heart swelled with pride. Watching the person you love finally achieve the impossible is a profoundly beautiful experience, until you realize you are slowly being pushed into the shadows of the very life you helped build. The casual evening check-ins about our days stopped completely. Dinner conversations turned into aggressive, one-sided lectures about venture capital, board restructurings, and market dominance. He began employing personal assistants to manage his daily schedule, yet he seamlessly expected me to keep managing our domestic life like an unpaid housekeeper. When I finally brought up the prospect of reviving my deferred professional applications, he didn't even bother to glance up from the glowing screen of his tablet. "Why?" he asked, the word sharp and dismissive. I froze, caught off guard by the utter lack of empathy in his voice. "What do you mean why, Julian? It's the career track I set aside so we could get your firm off the ground." He shrugged his shoulders indifferently. "It just seems entirely redundant now. My company generates more than enough to sustain us. You don't need a title." Bit by bit, the egalitarian marriage we had forged dissolved into a traditional corporate hierarchy where he was the chief executive and I was an administrative afterthought. The business trips grew longer and wrapped themselves around weekends. The late-night strategy sessions became a permanent excuse for his absence. Every time I attempted to communicate my growing sense of isolation, he would use a highly practiced tone to minimize my reality. "You're overanalyzing things, Clara. You've always been prone to unnecessary anxiety. It's just the nature of scaling a multi-million-dollar enterprise." I desperately wanted to believe his explanations. I wanted to trust that the man I married was still in there somewhere, buried beneath the corporate armor. But the illusion shattered completely one evening while I was organizing our historical tax documents for our estate accountant. Deep within a digital folder, I stumbled upon a series of luxury boutique hotel reservations in Miami and Chicago, dates that didn't align with a single conference or board meeting on his public corporate calendar. I didn't storm into his home office demanding answers. I knew that blind accusations would only cause him to delete evidence and tighten his security. Instead, I forced myself to become entirely still and observant. Once you stop listening to someone's words and start strictly watching their patterns, the truth becomes blindingly obvious. I noticed the sudden shift in how he carried his phone, always face down. I noticed the immediate deletion of text threads the moment he walked through the front door. I noticed the complex security codes suddenly applied to devices that had been completely unlocked for a decade. The definitive breaking point arrived on a Tuesday afternoon. Julian had returned home early to pack for another sudden trip, believing I was out of the house running errands. As I walked down the hallway toward our bedroom, I heard his voice echoing clearly through the cracked door. He was laughing, that same confident, easy laugh he used to reserve for me. "I'll initiate the legal separation by the end of the quarter," he was telling someone on the line. "Don't worry, my legal team is already shifting the asset structures. By the time she gets the paperwork, the core entity will look entirely separate from our marital history. She'll walk away with a standard baseline settlement, if that." My heart hammered against my ribs, but my mind went entirely quiet. The shock wasn't rooted in the fact that he wanted to end the marriage. It was the absolute calculation of it. He was planning an execution while I was still trying to save a partnership. I stood in that hallway, listening to the man I had financially sustained for years plot to leave me destitute. And in that exact moment, the last lingering shred of my devotion died. I didn't confront him that night. I didn't scream and I didn't shed a single tear. I sat by the window in the dark living room until the sky turned pale blue. The next morning, I bypassed our usual family attorney and scheduled a consultation with Evelyn Vance. No relation, just a brilliant, unyielding divorce strategist known for handling complex corporate asset concealments. During our initial meeting, Evelyn reviewed the brief summary I provided and leaned back in her high-backed leather chair. "Clara, if we want to challenge a corporate structure this sophisticated, we need concrete proof that your personal capital directly sustained the foundation of his enterprise. How much historical documentation do you actually possess?" Without a word, I lifted a heavy 3-inch thick binder out of my bag and placed it on her desk. Inside was a masterclass in financial tracking. Every single bank statement from our early years, joint tax filings, personal loan approvals, original software licensing receipts paid from my account, and archived email threads detailing every single month I covered the company's payroll out of my own pocket. Evelyn flipped through the pages, her eyes widening slightly as she took in the immaculate organization. You kept every single receipt from 2011 onward? I've spent my entire career analyzing corporate forensics, I replied quietly. Numbers don't have emotions and they don't lie. They simply state what occurred. Over the following 2 months, Julian's behavior grew increasingly hostile. He hired an aggressive, high-profile litigation firm known for bullying spouses into fast settlements. Mutual acquaintances began reaching out to me with nervous voices, letting me know that Julian was openly bragging at dinners about how the split would play out. He was telling everyone that I was trying to extort a company I had nothing to do with, claiming he had built the entire empire purely through his own genius. I listened to their warnings, thanked them for their concern, and kept my head down. I felt no need to defend my character to the public. The truth doesn't need to shout to be valid. Which brings us back to that decisive morning in the courtroom. Evelyn adjusted the folders on our defense table as the bailiff called the room to order. "Are you feeling anxious?" she murmured. I looked across the aisle at Julian. He was sitting back, whispering something to his lead counsel, completely detached from the gravity of what he was doing. "I'm not anxious at all," I said, a calm smile touching my lips. "I'm just ready for the records to speak." Julian's high-priced attorney stood up first, projecting a voice full of practiced theatrical confidence. "Your Honor," he began, gesturing expansively toward his client. "Mr. Carter is the sole visionary and architect of this logistics enterprise. While Mrs. Carter was present in the household during its growth, she provided no operational value, held no title, and made no measurable financial contribution to the development of the proprietary code or the acquisition of clients. We ask this court to honor the corporate separation and treat the business entirely as his independent, non-marital property." Julian offered a brief, satisfied nod toward the bench. He then turned his head to look directly at me, wearing that exact same smug expression he had used in the hallway earlier. It was chilling to realize that the man who once looked at me with absolute gratitude could now look at me like an adversary he needed to crush. The judge turned his attention to our side of the room. "Mrs. Vance, your opening statement." Evelyn rose with deliberate grace. "Your Honor, we choose to bypass a lengthy speech. We prefer to let the structural timeline of the marriage speak for itself." She walked calmly to the center of the well, holding the sealed envelope I had prepared, and passed it to the court clerk. "This is a certified chronological summary of the financial foundation of the respondent's company, cross-referenced with the discovery documents already provided." The judge pulled out a pair of reading glasses. "Let's see what we have here." He sliced the envelope open and began to read. The courtroom fell into a profound, heavy silence. Julian kept his arms crossed, completely unbothered, while his companion in the gallery checked her watch with an air of complete boredom. They truly believed this was a routine speed bump. But as the judge's eyes traveled down the first page, his posture shifted. He stopped, tapped his pen against the desk, and turned back to reread a specific paragraph. He spent a full 5 minutes absorbing the data before finally looking up, his gaze locking directly onto me. "Mrs. Carter, you compiled this summary yourself?" "Yes, Your Honor," I stood to answer. "The methodology is remarkably precise," he noted before returning his attention to the papers. The document wasn't an emotional plea. It contained no bitter adjectives or complaints about infidelity. It was a cold, unyielding timeline of mathematical facts. May 2012. Rachel Carter transferred $28,000 from her personal premarital savings account directly into the primary operating account of Carter Logistics to cover executive payroll during a critical funding shortfall. Bank confirmation receipt attached as Exhibit A. November 2013. Rachel Carter liquidated her personal investment portfolio to clear the company's outstanding server debts, preventing an involuntary shutdown by creditors. Transaction logs attached as Exhibit B. January 2014. Rachel Carter assumed 100% of all household financial obligations, including mortgage payments, corporate health insurance premiums, and utilities, allowing Julian Carter to reinvest all company revenue back into product development. Certified tax summaries attached as Exhibit C. Beneath the financial records lay the printed copies of Julian's historical emails. Messages he had long since deleted from his own devices but that remained preserved in my archives. The judge picked up one specific page and read the text silently. It was an email Julian had sent me at 3 a.m. from his office years ago. "Clara, the servers are paid for. We're still alive because of you. I swear to you, every single sacrifice you're making right now will be reflected in the future we build together. This company is as much yours as it is mine." I didn't turn around to see Julian's reaction, but I could feel the atmosphere in the room shifting dynamically. The absolute certainty that had filled his side of the table was beginning to evaporate. The judge pulled out the master financial disclosures submitted by Julian's legal team and began comparing them side by side with my timeline. He flipped back and forth, his face hardening with every passing second. Finally, he looked squarely at Julian. "Mr. Carter, please step to the podium." Julian stood up, though his movements were visibly stiffer now. "Yes, Your Honor." "In your sworn deposition," the judge said, his voice dropping to a low, dangerous register, "you testified under penalty of perjury that your enterprise was completely self-sustaining after its initial 12 months, and that no marital funds were ever commingled with the corporate operating capital. Is that still your testimony today?" Julian swallowed hard, his eyes darting briefly toward his attorney. That was my recollection, yes." The judge lifted my Exhibit A. "Then please explain this specific deposit of $28,000 into your business account on May 14, 2012. It matches down to the exact penny a withdrawal from your wife's personal account on that identical morning." Julian's lead counsel stood up immediately, trying to run damage control. "Your Honor, if there was an oversight in the historical accounting records, we are more than willing to—" "Sit down, counsel," the judge interrupted, his tone cutting through the room like a scalpel. "This isn't an oversight. This is a material misrepresentation of the foundational assets of this marriage." He turned another page of my binder. "Furthermore, your disclosures state that household expenses were handled independently. Yet these verified bank archives prove that Mrs. Carter carried the entire financial weight of your family for nearly 48 consecutive months while your company operated at a net loss. Mr. Carter, did you or did you not write these emails thanking her for saving your business from bankruptcy?" The room became so incredibly quiet that the sound of the air conditioning unit overhead felt deafening. Julian opened his mouth to speak but no sound came out. The polished, media-trained CEO had completely vanished, replaced by a man caught in the spotlight of his own deception. "Your Honor," Julian's attorney pleaded, his voice stripped of all its earlier arrogance. "We request a brief recess to confer with our client regarding the asset schedule." The judge slowly closed the binder and placed his pen neatly beside it. He looked across the courtroom, his eyes lingering on Julian's pale face before settling on me. "We will recess for the day," the judge announced calmly. "And let me be perfectly clear to the defense. This court does not take kindly to attempts to erase the documented contributions of a marital partner. I am ordering a comprehensive, independent forensic audit of the entire corporate entity from its inception to the present date before we reconvene." When the gavel struck the desk, Julian's companion in the gallery stood up quietly, picked up her designer purse, and slipped out the back doors without looking at him once. The forensic audit took 3 full weeks. During that period, the court-appointed investigators combed through every single contract, bank account, and hidden offshore holding Julian had established. I didn't spend those weeks celebrating or gloating to our mutual friends. There is no real victory in watching the destruction of a life he spent a decade trying to build. A marriage had failed, and no financial victory could change the profound sadness of that reality. When we returned to the courtroom for the final ruling, Julian looked like a completely different person. The expensive suit was the same, but the posture was broken. The certainty in his eyes had been entirely replaced by exhaustion. The judge took his seat and read the final determination into the record. The forensic accounting confirms beyond any doubt that Mrs. Carter's personal financial interventions were the critical factor that kept the respondent's enterprise solvent during its formative years. Therefore, the court recognizes the corporation as a fully joint marital asset. The valuation will be divided equally, along with a significant adjustment to account for the attempted concealment of marital property. It was over. There were no dramatic outbursts, no tears, and no theatrical speeches. Just the quiet, immovable weight of the facts. As the courtroom emptied out, Julian remained seated at his table, staring blankly at the polished wood. His legal team had already packed their briefcases and departed. For the first time in years, the two of us were completely alone in a room. I closed my briefcase and began walking toward the exit when he softly called out my name. Clara. I stopped near the doorway and turned around. I was completely wrong, he said, his voice cracking slightly. He looked down at his trembling hands. I spent the last few years convincing myself that because I was the one doing the public interviews and signing the contracts, I was the only one who mattered. I forced myself to forget how much I needed you just to survive the beginning. I looked at him, and to my own surprise, I felt absolutely no anger left inside me. Only a profound sense of closure. I didn't give up my fellowship or drain my savings because I wanted a percentage of a company, Julian, I said softly. I did it because I loved you and I believed in our partnership. He closed his eyes tightly. I know. And I threw it away for an illusion. I just wanted the truth to be recognized, I replied. You deserve to face the reality of what we built together. A month later, the final divorce decree was formally executed. The settlement was substantial, but I chose not to use that capital to indulge in luxury items or revenge spending. Instead, I invested every single dollar into opening my own independent financial forensics firm, an agency explicitly dedicated to helping small, family-owned businesses structure their assets safely and transparently so that no partner can ever be erased from the narrative of their own hard work. Fascinatingly, the professional dream I had set aside 15 years ago to support Julian's company became the exact cornerstone of my new life. On my very first day of business, as I turned the key to my new office door and looked at my name etched cleanly onto the glass, I realized something profound. For years, I believed my personal worth was entirely dependent on whether the person next to me appreciated what I did. I was completely wrong. My value was never determined by his recognition. The judge didn't create it, the documents didn't manufacture it, and the court settlement didn't grant it. It had been there all along, woven into every sacrifice I had ever made. And as I stepped inside to welcome my first client, I smiled, knowing that the most resilient foundation I would ever stand upon was the one I had finally built for myself.